Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Igor Zuckerman. I'm a president and chief investment officer of Passpon Advisors. And today I'm here to talk to you about thematic investing. We're going to talk about what it is, where it belongs to your portfolio, why should you care, and how would you invest in themes using ETFs and fintech. So let's jump right into it. Um, so what are the investing themes? A theme typically is a trend due to economic or demographic, geopolitical or regulatory or technology factor. It's typically something that if used right can generate very um, a theme can generate beneficial investment opportunities. And when I say may, that means if it's used right. If you recognize the trend early and identify the correct investment opportunities, that could lead to significant market outperformance. Investment themes have been a staple in traditional institution portfolios. It's been one of the strategies that has been routinely used for alpha generation for decades. But unfortunately, it used to require a dedicated research team and usually active management. And typically, up until very recently, it's been prohibitively expensive for individual investors. So, what are some of the investment themes? What exactly are we talking about? Um, Technological factors that create a theme would probably provide some of the easier examples. Um, so, think back to the 80s, rise of personal computers. Um, that was a predominant theme in technology in the early 80s. If you were able to identify Microsoft and Intel, for example, as the leaders, as your um, investment opportunity within that theme, well, if you did, the chances are you wouldn't be talking, or you wouldn't be listening to this webinar and to me right now. But hopefully, you're getting the idea. Um, in the 90s, the wide adaptation of the internet, Cisco systems, that was one of the companies that was one of the many obvious beneficiaries. If you think about internet search, e-commerce, social media, and the companies associated with that, Google, Amazon, Facebook. Um, Again, these are all examples of the themes and investments that benefited from that theme. A more recent example in biotechnology is the advances in genomics, and there is also a number of different beneficiaries of that. Um, but the other factors that I've mentioned can also produce pretty wild themes that can develop for years and sometimes decades with many beneficiaries. Um, so on the geopolitical and economic front, think about rise of China and the BRICS, the largest emerging economies. That was mostly the previous decade, and that also generated quite a few investment opportunities. Another popular theme is the world population growth and demand for food and clean water. Um, it's generally true for most commodities, but especially the agricultural commodities and the companies that are involved in that industry that have been the beneficiaries of that trend, and chances are this is going to continue for decades also. On the demographic front, um, a number of big demographic shifts create investment themes. In U.S., for example, the generation of baby boomers entering the retirement age creates a very big potential opportunity in investments for a number of companies that provide different types of services to that generation. Another one is population growth of the Hispanic community within the U.S., one of the largest, actually the largest, the fastest growing minority in terms of population in the U.S., and obviously that potentially presents a number of opportunities also within within that investment theme. Regulatory is another one. Back in the 90s, the telecom industry has been deregulated. Up until early 90s, AT&T was actually the largest company in the world, believe it or not. And after the deregulation, there was a proliferation of the baby bells, and then eventually the rise of the wireless companies that promoted competition, that decreased the prices for the consumers, but within that theme allowed quite a few companies to come essentially from nowhere, and allowed great investment opportunities for those who identified the trend and the right investment opportunities early. Much is to be said about a potential regulation of banks post the crisis of 2008. This is potentially the opposite situation. Obviously, the increased regulation. One of the things that came out of it so far is the rise of the fintech, which actually makes this presentation possible. But this is another trend that's actually ongoing, something that investors should be aware of. So hopefully you have now an idea of what we're talking about in terms of themes. And as I mentioned before, this used to be the area for institutional investing just exclusively. So why things are different now? Well, it's up to essentially these three things. The first and the most important is that the investment climate has changed. The new generation, the millennials, are a lot more picky in terms of where they want the money to go. They actually demand to know where it is. There's been a lot of research done. That's not to say that others never did care, but the millennial generation has a much higher percentage of respondents who feel that it's important to know where the money goes, and also want to pick where they want to invest. So that gave rise to a number of different companies searching for a solution to satisfy the demand, and within ETF industry, the proliferation of that industry allows for a lot of new and independent providers, excuse me, to bring new products to the market much easier. I apologize. It allows smaller companies to fairly easily bring new products to the market in an efficient manner and pretty affordably. So that allows innovation within ETF industry. It allows to answer the call to bring thematic ETFs to the investors. And then the third factor is fintech, as I've already mentioned. It has gone a long way to deliver solutions to the masses that are much cheaper than the traditional financial institutions, which, due to their size and partially due to the regulation, have not been able to keep up as of yet with the more nimble, smaller companies that are providing those solutions. So I am sure that most people on the phone are familiar with the ETF, an exchange-traded fund. I just want to do a quick overview. Few may be familiar with the facts of how far the industry has really come. So these are just a few highlight points. Today there is more than 1,900 ETFs listed in US. It's a pretty mind-boggling number. It's been growing steadily, and even though there have been some ETF closures, the new funds far outpace the closures. The combined assets under management of the ETF industry recently has surpassed the combined assets under management of all the hedge funds. If you just stop for a second and think about that's really staggering, and that's probably something that 5 years ago it was hard to imagine, but it's a fact now. So this is largely due to the fact that a lot of ETFs are not just being used by individual investors, but they're being used by institutions, they're being used by advisors. It's mainstream. ETFs are here to stay. But also, if you think about the growth, where those new ETFs come from, pretty much any significant index that's out there in terms of passive investment, any significant investment such as asset class has been covered by an ETF up until this point. So you're not going to find a new S&P 500 index ETF coming out anywhere. There is just basically no point. You're not going to see another gold ETF or another U.S. Treasury ETF. Chances are those asset classes have been covered, and even though those respective ETFs may still be growing, there's not going to be a new ETF in that area. So where does the growth come from? Recently, the new ETFs have been issued in those three areas that I've listed here. One is active management, the other one is smart beta, and the third is thematic. I will only briefly mention, so active management, these are ETFs that are that do not follow a passive index, but are actually managed actively by a portfolio manager. While that area has been growing, it has been still under a microscope. I would say the jury is still out, mainly because not all of them have been able to prove their value, that they actually do provide alpha to the investor, and they still have fairly high costs associated with them, which are similar to mutual funds, and so the question often becomes whether or not it's actually worth the trouble for the investors. Smart beta, that's been a very hot topic lately. For those unfamiliar, I'm just gonna briefly explain that this is something. Smart beta essentially is the technique of weighting the portfolio by measures other than the market cap, the traditional sort of beta comparison to the market. Some of the examples of that include equal weight, earnings, Volatility, that's been very popular lately. Momentum, sometimes you wait by dividends, and lately there have been a slew of new ETFs issued that are multi-factor, so they would take a combination of the above or sometimes even more factors, and they will basically rebalance the portfolio on a regular basis, monthly or quarterly, based on these multiple factors. What you need to know about these, and obviously there's a ton of material out there on the web, and on Bright Talk you can find a number of different presentations that deal with smart beta. So if you're interested, you can look into that. But basically, a lot of big players have entered the fray lately, and I'm talking about companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase, not to mention many others. It's getting harder to differentiate themselves. It's getting a little confusing for the investors potentially, and in my opinion, that market is getting a little oversaturated. So that brings me to thematic ETFs. So some of those themes that I mentioned before, or some of those types of themes, can be wrapped into an ETF product. Typically, they would be based on emerging technologies or megatrends. They're often brought by small firms, much smaller than Goldman Sachs, and in many cases, the first mover advantage is absolutely the key. If a theme is not covered by anybody, you have an opportunity. There's very rarely room for more than one ETF that covers the same theme. So, what are some of the companies that are in this space? Pure Funds is one of the leaders in the space, and they're the new technology specialist. And chances are you may have not heard of the company, but you've heard of their flagship ETF that took the space by storm less than 2 years ago. It's the cybersecurity ETF with a very memorable ticker symbol HACK. It has garnered over $1 billion under management with just about 6 months under existence. A number of factors played into that. Timing and a little bit of luck perhaps played a big role. But this is one theme that clearly struck a chord with investors, and that's one of the most popular ETFs in the space. They also have all of these other ones, including mobile payments, big data, and very recent additions to the lineup, drone economy, and video game technologies. So as you can see, some interesting themes, and these guys continue to work on issuing more. Another company that is also a leader in the industry is the ARK Investment Management, a fairly new company, again about maybe 3 years old. They issue ETFs for the most part. They're actively managed ETFs, but they're based on their selection is based on innovations in different field. So they have one innovation ETF, overall innovation, I would say. But in addition to that, they have the industrial innovation, the biotechnology innovation, specifically focusing on genomic revolution, and then another fund that they call VAB X.0, which is the new internet-based technologies. Also very interesting theme. Recently, they've become the first ETF to invest in Bitcoin. So a part of that VAB X.0 ETF is an actual Bitcoin investing. So if you're interested in that, this is something to look into. They've also filed for its currently in registration the first passive index ETF. that will be covering 3D printing, another hot area that goes through sort of a boom and a bust, and a potentially beginning of another boom right now. So again, a first ETF that will cover 3D printing, and I believe actually right now on Bright Talk, within literally a day or two, they're doing a presentation on that separately. If you're interested, you should check that out as well. But these are not the only companies that are doing thematic investing. Obviously, there is a number of different thematic ETFs. I can't possibly list all of them here, but I will mention a few more. So BlackRock, the king of ETFs with their iShares brand, they have recently issued this ETF called Exponential Technologies. Spider, which is another one of the big three in the ETF space, has fact-set index-based innovative technology. A smaller company, Gavical Knowledge Leaders, they have two versions of their ETF, one for companies in developed world and one in emerging markets. The Investors Business Daily, with their famous IBD 50 index and the canceling methodology, they have also an ETF that's been fairly popular, also actively managed. You may have noticed all of these that I just mentioned, they are based on innovation, and different companies try to come up with a different index or different methodology to try to follow innovation. Two other companies that are probably familiar to companies that follow asset management, the traditional mutual fund company, Janus, jumped in with these 4 new ETFs, all of these issued this year. Global X, which is a niche ETF issuer, also issued these 3 just this year again. So as you can see, the ones that Global X is covering is less technology but more sort of demographic and economic, I would say, types of themes. So again, more companies are looking into this space and are trying to enter it and attract investors. So with all of that, why bother with fintech? Well, it's simple. ETFs, as good of a solution as that may be compared to institutional investing, fintech actually may do some things even better than the ETFs. For example, you may be able, with the right fintech solution, you may be able to come up with an investable product in a theme essentially instantaneously, where it takes 3 to 6 months for an ETF to get there. You may have lower investment minimums if you only need to invest into one theme, for example. You're not going to be subject to broker minimums. Liquidity might depend. If you don't have the ETF wrapper, you may be able to deal with individual components that may be more liquid. You would potentially save on costs. And of course, for an ETF to succeed, you need to gather certain amount of assets under management to cover the basic cost. If you're an ETF issuer, that's paramount to you. So it's very difficult to go after smaller themes, or the ones that you are afraid may not resonate with the larger group of investors, where with fintech you practically don't have that restriction. So in that space, the company that rules is Motif Investing. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of it, but here's a quick overview. So the company calls a Motif something, basically a basket of up to 30 securities. The Motif would trade as a single entity for one low retail commission. the company provides easy and low-cost rebalancing, which you can do basically at any point. And it allows for flexible custom portfolio with effectively no account minimum, although I believe the minimum to execute one motif is $250. So they would actually take care of things like partial shares, which is also very important and makes it very easy for investors to do. They're backed by investors such as Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. They've been on the CNBC Disruptor 50 list, I believe, for 3 years running. Some of the different ways you can use Motif, they're just listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the important thing is with Motif, you can do a number of different themes that I've mentioned before, or potentially even other ideas. You may have other uses and essentially have your entire portfolio there. So to put it all together, to find the theme and investment choices, obviously there are a lot of different ideas out there, and what you want to do is find a theme that resonates with you, and then look for an ETF or for someone else who through fintech perhaps who will provide you with the investment choices to invest in it. What's important is also diversification. I am sure you've heard this term from every investment professional you've ever talked to. And let me just reiterate that in thematic investing, it's absolutely paramount. Let me give you a couple of quick examples here. Suppose you've identified internet search as one of the trends for decades to come back in the late 90s. Back then, if you wanted to build a portfolio, if you wanted to invest in that theme, if you picked leaders, those would be companies called Lycos and Excite, the two largest publicly traded multi-billion-dollar companies. Does anyone even remember those companies now? But if you invested in a basket of stocks that were involved in this business, and you would have Google and Yahoo survive, even those companies that withered and died, you would have been far ahead of the market. So that's where diversification comes in. Another quick example that I'll give was another smaller niche, another theme back in the 90s called business to business. The ETF was BHH, and it used to have over 25 components back in the 90s. By 2010, the ETF was still around, but it only had 2 components left. All the other companies have either gone bankrupt or have been acquired. Yet the last standing company in there, Ariba Networks, was purchased by SAP for over $4 billion back in 2012. So again, the basket approach, the diversification would have paid off, even though most of these companies would have been terrible investment. So moving on, how do you approach thematic investing in your portfolio? We would typically advocate tactical allocation, and how would it fit into your portfolio? Well, this is where we come in. So a few words about us. We're Passport Advisors. We're a new boutique company. We're doing portfolio management. We're doing investment advice for different types of clients, but the main point that we're trying to advocate, what we think makes us different, is that we allow for different thematic investing options through our platform. As you may have guessed, we are using Motif Investing for that thematic portion, but we also take a holistic look at the portfolio, and we create one for you. Well, my apologies for the late introduction, but this is me. And here's my email address in there as well, so you can email me at any point with any questions you may have. But here's our approach to themes. So we have identified about 25 growth themes for the next decade. There's about 15 of them that we're actively building an index for. We've actually talked to index providers to index up to 3 themes that may be used for ETFs soon. Here's a list of some of the themes that we used to have that others have already turned into ETFs, just to give you an idea. And to paraphrase the famous MasterCard commercial, for everything else, there's Motif. I apologize for the for maybe hard to see a screenshot, but this is our portfolio allocation process. Basically, on our website, passponadvisors.com, you can find model portfolio, where all you have to do is answer 3 simple questions. They're multiple choice, and then after that, so this is about you and your investment choices and investment horizon and risk tolerance. And then there is a subset of larger investment themes, which is a sample of our theme universe. And within each one of those, there is a sample of actual portfolios that we've built to follow those themes. So in this case, again, I apologize, it's hard to see, but the choices that have been taken are clean tech and biotech cutting edge. And as you can see on the right, we build this portfolio for you on the fly. Again, this is a model portfolio. This is a simplified version of what we would use. But it essentially assigns, in this case, you have 9% of your portfolio that would be assigned to these custom ETFs, or rather custom baskets. They're not ETFs, they are Motif portfolios that we have built. And that would be the tactical allocation within the rest of your portfolio. And by the way, it shows you the graph of how this portfolio would have done historically, so you get a quick back test compared to the market. And that includes all the other allocations, the more traditional allocations to equity, fixed income, and alternatives. So this is essentially what we do, and this is how we would fit within the thematic investing, and how we can help you to build a portfolio and to find a space for it for the themes that you care about, that you value, or that you believe will be the next big thing. So these are just a couple of Motif examples. We have nearly 300 of them available on Motif Platform through their advisor platform. And we're working on more, and some of them are not public, some of them are not available to everybody, just to the clients. But this should give you a quick idea of the types of portfolios that are out there and how they do compare to the market. And so for the final word, just in case you're wondering what the name is, a pass pawn is a chess term for a pawn that has a clear path to becoming a queen, which is usually something that provides an owner with an uncommon upside and becomes a game changer. So if you're ready to change the game, by all means, give us a call, send us an email. we'll be happy to help. And with that, I think we're done with the portion with the presentation up until now. So at this point, I am happy to take any questions that the audience would have. Feel free to just type in your questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody may have. It doesn't look like there is a lot of questions out there. Hopefully that means that I've done a good job explaining the subject, but please don't hesitate. I'll give you another quick minute. All right, then. We appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much for listening. You have my contact information in there, my email, and there's a website address as well. Check us out. If you have any questions about us, about thematic investing, please feel free to reach out. And it's been great talking to you today. Have a good day.